The year is 1414, and there are 3 popes. Well, technically 3 claimants to the papacy, each with widespread support. After centuries of accumulating power, the papacy would crumble under its own weight. And at the end of the day, no pope could save the quickly dividing church. Instead, it was up to a king and a crew of cardinals to not only solve this monumental problem, but deal the biggest blow to papal power seen in centuries. You're listening to A History of the Papal Primacy, based on Klaus Schatz's Papal Primacy. Last week we mentioned the pivotal figure of Pope Gregory VII, whose tenure began in the early 11th century. Pope Gregory was met with the challenge of a growing empire, one whose bishops were corrupt, local communities often formed cults, and angry mobs would burn heretics at the stake on a whim. Gregory knew that he needed decentralized papal authority to mitigate all of these issues. It is a myth that the papacy grabbed power for its own sake. By the height of the Middle Ages, Rome had a hard time keeping up with the many requests for financial, military, and missionary assistance that came from every corner of the empire. There was serious corruption, so much that most of the church councils called around this time constantly introduced legislation to keep the papacy and his administration, known as the Curia, pure. This was a serious ongoing problem. In 1363, Pope Urban V asserted once again that the appointment of all bishops belonged to the Pope alone. This had been tried before, but Urban V was a powerful man who meant business. And where was Pope Urban when he made this declaration? Why, in the center of all Catholicism in the whole world, Avignon, which is in modern France. Yeah, so for political reasons that you can learn about in my Ecumenical Councils series, the Pope moved to France in 1309, mostly to get away from the Roman aristocratic class that was troubling him. After the Pope who had moved there died, the largely French College of Cardinals elected a new Pope, who decided to keep the papacy in France. And so did the next one, and the next one. Yeah, popes continued to reign from Avignon for about 68 years. So this was a problem. The papacy not only belonged in Rome for theological reasons, but the Pope was also considered the leader of the territories known as the Papal States. Theologians, politicians, and even saints had serious problems with the papacy remaining in Avignon. So, St. Catherine of Siena managed to convince Pope Gregory IX to return to Rome in 1377, where he died. Here's the problem. 68 years of the papacy in France meant a lot of French cardinals. Basically an entire generation of French cardinals. And the Italians knew this. So when Pope Gregory died, they knew a French pope would be elected who would want to move the papacy back to France. So the cardinals in Rome voted on a new pope before the French cardinals could even arrive. The pope they chose, Urban VI, was very set on restoring the papacy's power in Rome. Just 3 months into his papacy, the French cardinals rebelled, declared his election invalid, and elected their own pope. So for simplicity's sake, I'll say we have an Italian pope and a French pope. The Germans, Italy, of course, Northern Europe, Eastern Europe, and England supported the Italian pope. France, the Iberian Peninsula, and Scotland backed the French pope, who died and had a successor. So this wasn't the first time the church saw dueling popes. But this was the first time that the situation wasn't very quickly resolved. At this point, kings and princes took sides. How could this be resolved? How about having both popes resign and electing a new one? In 1408, that's exactly what the cardinals did. Both popes agreed to a meeting place where the cardinals would elect a new pope and they could all live happily ever after. The problem is that neither of them showed up. Yeah, they both backed out at the last minute. This was the consequence of all the accumulation of papal power. If the Pope was above the law, he could not be removed. However, what if the Pope was a heretic? Who would make such a determination? What about every other bishop? What about an ecumenical council? For a while, the cardinals had grown weary of the Pope's unilateral authority. For example, in 1328, Pope John XXII excommunicated 36 bishops for not paying him money they owed. That's hardly a theological issue. In response to situations like this, theologians came up with a theory called conciliarism, which basically means that in certain situations, a council of bishops, especially an ecumenical council, was above a pope. And this two-pope situation was the perfect scenario to test this system. So, cardinals of both popes who refused to step down met in Pisa in 1409. They put both popes on trial and deposed them as heretics and schismatics. Their crime? Violating the unquestionable belief that the Church must be one and holy. This is crucial because it demonstrates how the entire power structure of the Church rests upon Christ's immortal desire for unity among his faithful. The cardinals elected Alexander V as their new pope. He died and was succeeded by Pope John XXIII. Now, some of you historically minded listeners might be thinking, Pope John XXIII, wasn't he elected in the 1950s? Yes, and that is because in hindsight, the Church does not recognize the elections of Pope Alexander V and John XXIII in the Middle Ages as valid. Here's why. Neither of the two deposed popes gave up their power, nor did their political allies. After 5 years, the German king Sigismund had enough. He was a strong leader who called a council in Constance in 1414. John XXIII, who I will refer to as the Pisan Pope, since he was elected in Pisa, thinking his papacy would be the valid one, attended the council. King Sigismund, however, had no dog in this race. All he wanted was to preserve Christian unity by any means possible, so he convinced John to resign at the council. John had second thoughts, though, and fled. The council was left in a pickle. They had no pope to lead them. However, recognizing the futility of getting the three popes to back down, they solemnly declared in 1415 that the council had its own authority from Christ that everyone, including the pope, must obey for the purpose of eradicating schism and reforming the Church. The council laid out stringent checks and balances on the office of the papacy. The only one of the three popes who agreed to these was Pope Gregory XII. He was from the original Roman line, the Italian line, rather than the French or Pisan one. Pope Gregory even endorsed the council itself. The other claimants to the papacy never admitted defeat, though eventually their lineages fizzled out due to a lack of popular support. Now, I mentioned some checks and balances placed on papal authority. What were these? The council solemnly declared that councils need to be held every 7 years, during which the cardinals would kind of check in on the pope and audit him more or less. Pope Martin V, Gregory's successor, reluctantly went along with this. Pope Eugene IV, whom I covered extensively in my series on no salvation outside the Church, disliked these councils even more. However, one of these councils, held in Basel, proved quite fortuitous for the Holy Father. At first, Pope Eugene wanted to move the council somewhere else, but backed down once the cardinals shut him down. There was no political will to counter the cardinals. This all changed once the Greek Orthodox Church came to Pope Eugene, ready to talk reunification with the Roman Catholic Church. They did this largely to gain military support against the Muslims. The Greeks preferred a council closer to them, so Pope Eugene demanded the cardinals move the council to Ferrara and eventually Florence in 1439. The cardinals, perhaps not reading the political temperature of the room, not only refused to follow him, but issued a very strict dogmatic declaration on the unconditional supremacy of a council over a pope. This statement said that a council is above a pope cannot dissolve, interrupt, or transfer a council, and anyone who denies these two facts is a heretic. Pope Eugene, seeing the value in reunification with the Greek Orthodox, ignored it and was declared by the cardinals as a heretic. The cardinals elected a new pope, Felix, and the two popes struggled against each other for 10 years, though gradually most of the cardinals came to support Eugene. Oh great. Two popes again. How will this ever be resolved? Well, fairly easily actually. Barely an inconvenience. Felix, under immense pressure, resigned in 1449. The remaining cardinals who had supported Felix elected a man named Thomas Parenticelli as their pope. Here's the thing. Parenticelli was already recognized as the Pope by the same cardinals who had elected Eugene. Basically, both sides elected the same man to the papacy, an ideal solution. Going back to Pope Eugene, how did he win the conflict against the cardinals? Arguably, he made a deal with the devil, politicians. Eugene won great favor from kings, princes, and powerful families. His reliance on them, though, meant a whole lot of favors he had to fulfill. These favors eventually turned into demands. For example, countries got back their right to nominate bishops. In fact, in many places throughout the empire, if you were elected a bishop, you were made a prince. Fun fact, there's actually a handful of countries where this is still the case. The Pope also now needed the permission of secular rulers to publish edicts, which we'll cover later in this series. This proved a massive headache to the Church. So while technically the Pope still had theological jurisdiction over both temporal and spiritual leaders, the former learned how to bully the papacy into doing what it wanted, and the latter clung on to the notion of conciliarism for dear life. This was indeed a difficult time for papal authority, and the problems it faced would only be exacerbated by oncoming political and theological revolutions caused by a great event known as the Reformation. We'll cover that next time. Until then, have a great day. God bless you.